The morning started like any other, with the familiar sound of the kettle beeping and the smell of toasted bread filling the kitchen. But something in the air felt heavy, as if the house knew before me that this day would be unusual. Eduardo and Marina arrived together, which was already strange enough to make me alert. They don't usually agree even on the temperature of the coffee, let alone show up together at my door. When I felt Eduardo's hard look, my stomach contracted. We sat down at the table, and the silence was so dense that you could almost cut it with a knife. Marina clasped her hands in her lap, her eyes running away from mine as if looking for a safe spot on the wall. Eduardo took a deep breath, puffing up his chest as he did when he was about to announce something unpleasant. I expected complaints, perhaps about the old house or the lack of renovations. But what came next left me cold. It was as if my own son had transformed before my eyes. "You're forgetting things, Mom," he said, in a voice that mixed impatience and false worry. My mind spun trying to look for some example to justify that accusation, but nothing came. Marina confirmed with a shy nod, avoiding my gaze like a child who knows she's doing something wrong. I felt the ground shake slightly beneath my feet, as if it was about to collapse. I didn't say anything, I just waited for the final sentence. It was then that Eduardo placed papers on the table, pushing them towards me. "We need to discuss your ability to manage your assets," he continued, and the word capacity hit my ears like a punch. I felt my face burn, more from shame than anger. How could they? How did my own children think I was no longer able to take care of my life? Without realizing it, my hands trembled when I touched the paper. There seemed to be a chasm between us. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky when I asked what exactly they were talking about. Marina bit her lower lip, clearly uncomfortable, while Eduardo leaned forward, bringing his face closer to mine. "It's for your good, Mom," he said, as if I were a stubborn child. It was at that moment that I realized, they were not worried about me. They were worried about my things, what I would leave behind. The word interdiction echoed in the kitchen like thunder. My heart raced in a way that didn't happen even when I was young and in love. The house, so full of memories, began to seem hostile, as if the walls witnessed that humiliation and kept the complicit silence of a mother's destruction. I saw them standing up, filling the room with rehearsed speeches about protection and responsibility. But I only heard one thing: the life I had built for decades was taking away from me. It was a clear blow to my pride. When I tried to argue, Eduardo laughed disdainfully. It wasn't a loud laugh, but the kind of laugh that says, "You don't have a voice anymore." Marina still avoided my eyes, and that hurt more than any words spoken. She was always the most sensitive, the one who ran away from fights, but there she was letting her brother speak for her. I felt a deep tightness in my chest, a mixture of helplessness and disbelief. It was as if she had aged 10 years that morning. They talked about my age, about the house too big, about accounts that I supposedly confused. I kept searching my memory for any mistake I might have made, but nothing justified that attack. It was as if they were building a case against me, using any detail to paint me as incapable. The feeling of being judged without defense made me dizzy. I felt my body getting heavy in the chair. When they finally left, the house was absolutely silent. But it was a different silence, a silence that screamed. I stood up slowly, leaning on the counter, trying to recover the air that seemed not to reach my lungs. My children's accusation echoed like a cruel mantra in my head. Me, incapable. Me, fragile. Me, inadequate. The label chased me down the hallway, where my old photos seemed to be watching me with pity. I closed the door behind them, and at that moment, I felt something break inside me. The life I had built with so much effort seemed to be slipping through my fingers without me being able to do anything. I didn't know it yet, but that would only be the first blow. The threat to my peace, my home, and my dignity was just beginning, and I, who have always been seen as fragile, would have to learn to fight. If this story has already hooked you so far, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next revelations. Night came, but sleep did not. I spent hours walking around the house, as if each step could organize the thoughts that ran over each other inside me. The kitchen table still bore marks from the papers Eduardo had pushed at me, like recent scars I couldn't ignore. The fear began to grow in waves, taking over my chest from time to time. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air seemed insufficient. It was as if the house was shrinking. In the morning, I heard noises coming from the living room. When I went down the stairs, I found Marina rummaging through drawers, papers, and documents. She didn't even notice my presence right away, so focused was she on her own despair. When he finally saw me, he tried to justify in a faltering voice that he needed to organize the family's paperwork. The excuse was as weak as his guilty look. It was clear that he was looking for something, or he wanted to hide something else. I approached slowly, asking what exactly she was looking for. Marina averted her eyes, always her weak point when she tried to lie. She said she was worried about me, that she needed to make sure everything was in order in case something happened. The phrase struck me like a cold blade. In case something happened. It was as if they were already planning my absence. I felt a sudden vertigo and had to rest my hand on the sofa. Marina asked me to rest, which sounded more like an order than advice. She tried to take the documents from my hand when I took one of the envelopes, but I held on tight. I would not so easily hand over what belonged to me. Her expression changed for a moment, a mixture of frustration and fear. Something was very wrong, and that behavior only confirmed my suspicions. They were up to something and didn't make a point of disguising it. When Eduardo returned, he came even more aggressive than before. He began to walk around the house as if he owned it, opening doors, checking cabinets, writing things down on a pad. I watched him silently, feeling indignation and a pang of sadness. It was as if I had become a visitor in my own home. He spoke fast, mentioning lawyers and court decisions, as if he were preparing a siege. My world was being taken over without permission. I tried to call the two to talk, but Eduardo interrupted before I even finished the sentence. He said that I was emotionally shaken and that I was not in a position to make important decisions. It was there that I realized the psychological game they were trying to play with me, to turn my every hesitation into proof of incapacity, every emotion, in weakness. Each momentary confusion, in justification to control myself. Anger arose, timid but real. When they mentioned the possibility of selling the house to make things easier, something inside me exploded silently. The house was not just a place. It was where I lived my happiest years, where I raised my children, where I cried the death of my husband. To lose this house would be to lose my own history. They were trying to erase my life under the guise of worry. The injustice of this hit me like a storm. The tension was increasing more and more. Eduardo talked about numbers, Marina cried, and I felt crushed between demands and recriminations. Their pressure surrounded me on all sides, as if they were trying to suffocate me with memorized arguments. I knew that if I gave in at that moment, I would lose much more than bricks and furniture. I would lose my identity, so I remained firm, even with my legs shaking. When they finally left, the house was overturned as if it had been robbed. Documents out of place, drawers open, books lying on the floor. I looked around and felt a lump in my throat. It was no longer my home, it was a battlefield, and I was fighting alone. I ran my hand through the furniture, trying to regain some sense of control, but it was like trying to hold water with my hands. That night, I sat on the living room floor with all the documents scattered in front of me. I tried to organize everything, but my mind was tired and my heart was in pieces. I knew I needed to react, but I didn't know how or when. What I didn't imagine was that the answer to everything was hidden close to me, waiting to change my life irreversibly. The next morning began with an eerie silence, the kind of silence that heralds a storm. I was on the balcony trying to breathe when I saw Eduardo arriving again, this time accompanied by a man in a dark suit. My heart sank before they even spoke a word. It was impossible not to feel that something terrible was about to happen. They entered without asking permission, as if the house was not already mine. The man opened a briefcase and began to explain, in a cold voice, that they were formalizing protective measures. The expression he wore was so rehearsed that it seemed to have no soul. Eduardo crossed his arms, looking at me as if he was waiting for me to fall apart. I remained standing, but my hands trembled so much that I had to hide them behind my body. The feeling of being pushed into an abyss grew more with each sentence of that stranger. He showed me documents full of difficult words, but the meaning was clear. They wanted to convince me to sign something that would take away my right to decide about my own life. I tried to read, but each line seemed like a direct attack on my dignity. When I asked why this was necessary, Eduardo said it was to avoid future problems. Future problems for whom? The answer was too obvious. I refused to sign, and the air in the room became as heavy as lead. Eduardo closed his expression and the lawyer collected the papers with camouflaged irritation. I saw, in my son's eyes, not worry, but frustration, as if I were disrupting a plan already outlined. The hurt rose through my throat like fire, burning everything. The desire to scream was great, but the desire to resist was greater. The lawyer suggested that I think again, which sounded more like a polite threat than advice. They got up and walked to the door, and every step seemed to echo in my head. When the door closed, the whole house seemed to tremble. I felt my legs weaken, and I had to sit down to keep from falling. The idea of losing my home wasn't just scary, it was devastating. The room around me seemed strangely unfamiliar. Each photo, each piece of furniture, each memory now carried a weight that I had never felt before. It was as if they were ripping me out of my own history. I ran my hand over the back of the sofa, trying to find some emotional stability in that simple gesture, but everything seemed to slip through my fingers. Insecurity spread like a shadow. I got up with difficulty and walked to the hallway. There, I stopped in front of John's portrait hanging on the wall. His calm smile made me feel a mixture of nostalgia and revolt. Wherever he was, I had to believe that I wouldn't let myself go through this alone. But at that moment I could only feel the weight of loneliness. A loneliness so deep that it hurt in my chest. I opened a few drawers trying to find any document that could help me understand my situation. Old papers, paid bills, certificates, nothing there seemed useful. But everything reminded me that I always took good care of my life. I wasn't incompetent, I wasn't fragile as they tried to convince me. She was just a woman too old in the eyes of her own children, and that hurt more than any legal threat. When I realized it, I was already crying. Not a loud cry, but a silent cry, one of those that only the heart hears. I felt the bitter taste of injustice trickling down to my soul. It was as if they were erasing my existence, replacing it with a weak and incapable version of myself. But part of me knew that if I let myself fall now, they would win. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The threat was real, the pain was immense, but something inside me, perhaps the last remnant of the woman I once was beginning to awaken. I could not allow them to take what I have built, not without fighting. I still didn't know how I would do it, but I felt that the answer was closer than I imagined, much closer. I spent the whole afternoon trying to organize thoughts and documents, but my head felt like a whirlwind. The feeling of being hunted inside my own house made me uneasy. It was then that I decided to go up to the attic, a place I rarely visited. The smell of old wood and dust enveloped me as soon as I opened the door, bringing back dormant memories of a lighter time. But there was also something oppressive in the air, as if the past was waiting. I walked among boxes and furniture covered in sheets, until my eyes landed on John's old trunk. That piece was always special to him, and consequently, to me. I approached slowly, as if the trunk itself were alive. As he opened the lid, the creak echoed through the attic, a sound that seemed to break decades of silence. Inside, I found objects that I had already forgotten: yellowed photos, newspaper clippings, old letters. I carefully removed things, one by one, as if they were fragile treasures. The smell of aged paper brought tears to my eyes, but tears of longing, not pain. I kept moving until my fingers touched an envelope different from the others. It was more recent, the paper still firm, sealed in John's handwriting. My heart raced as if I had been scared. I felt my hands get cold. The envelope was addressed to me, that's all. No date, no explanation. For a moment, I thought about not opening it, as if the simple act of tearing that seal could unearth something that was destined to remain buried. But curiosity, mixed with a strange presentiment, spoke louder. I sat on the floor, took a deep breath, and carefully ran my finger over the hardened glue. As soon as I opened it, the first line of the letter made my entire body shudder. John began by saying that he had something important to confess before it was too late. My stomach churned and my hands became even more shaky. I continued reading, and each word seemed to tear a piece of the ground from under my feet. He always knew that Marina was not his biological daughter, and despite this, he chose to love her as a daughter. The revelation struck my chest like lightning. I never said anything, I never gave reason for suspicion, but he knew. And not only did he know, he suffered in silence. When I finished the part where he confesses to having discovered everything years before, I felt my breathing fail. It was as if a lifetime had been built on a minefield about to explode. I needed to stop reading, but I couldn't. The next part of the letter was even more disturbing. John mentioned that someone in the family had tried to use this secret against me in the past. He did not say the name, but he made it clear that this influenced the relationship between our children. The idea that someone so close had manipulated my back made my skin crawl. A betrayal within one's own home, within one's own family. It was a pain I didn't know I could still feel. I closed my eyes and let the letter fall on my lap. Everything made sense in a cruel way. The tensions between the brothers, the inexplicable resentment, the way Eduardo always looked at me with suspicion. It was as if the truth had been buried right in front of me for years, but only now had it gained a voice. A voice written in the handwriting of the man I loved all my life. The feeling of loss came like a strong wave, but it wasn't just the loss of John. It was the loss of the image I had of my own family, of my role as a mother, who I was all these years. I felt my hand tremble as I lifted the letter again, as if I was looking for a strength I didn't have yet. But something inside me started to move. A small spark, almost imperceptible. I stood up with the letter in my hands and looked around the attic. It was as if everything was watching me, waiting for my reaction. And in that moment, I realized that life was pushing me towards a truth that I didn't want but needed to face. My world was changing, and I couldn't hide anymore. The letter wasn't just a revelation, it was the beginning of a silent war. I came down from the attic with the letter in my hands as if I were carrying a bomb about to explode. Each step seemed higher than the last, and my legs were heavy, as if the very weight of truth was attached to them. I sat in the armchair in the living room, the same one where I watched my children take their first steps. Now, it was there that I would face the most painful step of my life. I opened the letter again, even though I knew I had read enough to never be the same again. John began by remembering our marriage, our simple life, our achievements little by little. He wrote as if he were talking to me there, in front of me, and it tore me inside. Soon after, the tone changed. He said that, years ago, something made him suspicious. Comments, dates, silences. Gradually, he put together a puzzle that I didn't even know existed. And then he wrote the sentence that left me breathless. I discovered that Marina is not my blood daughter. I felt my chest tighten, as if an invisible hand was holding him tightly. I never betrayed John in the way that phrase insinuated. Never. But there were things in our past, confusing moments, mistakes that I preferred to bury. He said he didn't confront me because he was afraid of losing me. He chose, in silence, to love Marina as his daughter. Each word was a mixture of love and pain that went through the years until it reached me. I felt judged and forgiven at the same time. I kept reading, even with the tears blurring my vision. John said that he kept this secret to protect his family, but that it also corroded him inside. He blamed himself for looking at Eduardo, sometimes harshly, as if his son had inherited some fault that was not his. I had never fully understood the distance between the two, but there everything began to make a cruel sense. Our family had been built on silences, not just on love. In the next part, he talked about someone within the family who, at one point, tried to use this truth against me. The name was not on the letter, but he mentioned insinuations, venomous comments, carefully planted suspicions. Someone knew, or thought they knew, and tried to make John hate me. Instead, he chose to love me, but he carried distrust in his chest. The idea of someone so close stabbing me in the back made me sick. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to remember gestures, looks, loose phrases that, at the time, made no sense. Now, however, everything seemed to fall into place. Small arguments, Eduardo's attitudes, Marina's inexplicable resentment. How could I not realize before that there was something very wrong? It was as if I had lived a whole life inside a play, without realizing that the script was different. The feeling of having been deceived by one's own story suffocated me. At the end of the letter, John made a request. He said that, if I had been reading those lines, he would probably have already left. And he asked me not to let this secret destroy what was left of our family. He wanted me to use that truth wisely, to keep greed and hatred from taking the place of love. It was a desperate plea from a man who had tried to fix something too late that he should never have broken. My hands began to shake so hard that I had to rest the letter on my lap. I didn't know whether to feel grateful that he loved me to the end or furious that he hid it from me. Maybe both at the same time. I thought of my children, out there, devouring themselves for an inheritance that didn't even exist, while the real treasure, the truth, was hidden in that envelope. It was a cruel irony of fate, which seemed to revel in my suffering. I looked around the room and everything looked different. The family photo on the sideboard, with the three of us smiling next to John, took on new weight. I wondered how many times he looked at that image wondering what could have been, if everything had been said before. The feeling of delay, of lost opportunity, cut through my soul. But something inside me began to move, even in the midst of chaos. Folding the letter carefully, I felt a certainty slowly forming inside me. I couldn't ignore what I had read, just as I couldn't let that truth be used against me. My children were already trying to destroy me inside, even without knowing everything. Maybe, just maybe, this letter was the only weapon I would have to defend myself. And for the first time in a long time, I thought about really fighting. After putting the letter away in a safe place, I went to the bathroom and barely recognized the face reflected in the mirror. It felt like I had aged years in a few hours. His eyes sunken, his countenance tired, his mouth trembling. I touched my own face as if it were a stranger's. Who was I now? The deceived mother, the wife betrayed by omission, the woman about to lose everything? None of these answers seemed sufficient. I felt broken into pieces. The floor seemed to sway beneath my feet as I walked through the house. Each room I crossed carried memories of a family I was now no longer sure I knew. I sat on the edge of the bed, remembering the nights when John slept next to me, breathing heavily after a day of work. How many of those nights did he keep this secret while I, by his side, slept peacefully, believing that we were at peace? The feeling of having been spared and, at the same time, excluded from the truth tore me apart. An old guilt began to knock on my door, insistent. Mistakes I made, choices I made, moments when I let myself be carried away by neediness, loneliness, the need to be seen. I had buried certain memories deep in my soul, like someone who pushes dust under the rug. Now, however, everything came back with a vengeance. I wondered if, in the end, I wasn't the root of all that pain. The question kept echoing without an answer. The tears finally came, this time without resistance. A deep, sobbing cry that seemed to mix past and present. I cried for the girl I was, for the woman I became, for the mother I tried to be. I cried for John, for everything he couldn't say in life. I cried for my children, who grew up in an environment where the truth was masked by good intentions and cowardly fears. It was as if, all of a sudden, I was grieving for a family that was still alive. I got up with difficulty and went to the kitchen to make some tea, an automatic gesture that I always used to try to calm my heart. But even the noise of boiling water irritated me. Nothing was normal, nothing was the same. As I watched the steam rise, I thought of Eduardo and Marina, the hard eyes of one and the confused look of the other. They had no idea what was behind the pain we felt. And I, was the only one who knew everything. I felt a strange urge to pick up the phone and call each of them, pour out the truth at once, without a filter, shouting that they knew nothing about what they were defending or attacking. But John's voice, in the last lines of the letter, echoed in my mind. He asked me for calm, wisdom, care. I knew that if I acted only out of pain, I could destroy any possibility of reconciliation. And as hurt as she was, there was still love. With the cup in my hands, I went to the living room and sat down in the armchair again. The silence of the house seemed heavier than before, but now I understood better where it came from. It wasn't just the loneliness of widowhood. It was the weight of secrets that should never have been kept. The weight of a lifetime built on decisions made in the dark. For the first time, I thought that maybe I needed help. Not only does it help emotionally, but it helps to face what was to come. It was at that moment that I heard a slight knock on the door. My heart raced, imagining that the children had come back with more accusations. I got up slowly, hurriedly wiping the tears from my face, and went to answer. When I opened the door, it was neither Eduardo nor Marina. It was Evelyn, my neighbor. She looked at me for a second and, without me saying anything, seemed to understand that something was deeply wrong. His gaze was not one of curiosity. It was of genuine concern. I invited her in, and she accepted without hesitation, like someone who knows she is in the right place. I sat at the table with her, still with the letter burning secretly inside me. Evelyn held my hand and asked if I was okay. The simple question broke down the last barrier I was still trying to maintain. I wasn't well, and for the first time in a long time, I considered telling the truth to someone outside my family. I took a deep breath and looked at her, feeling the weight of a decision forming on my lips. I could continue to carry everything on my own, as I have done all my life, or I could finally share this burden with someone willing to help me. I still didn't know that Evelyn would be much more than a good neighbor. At that moment, I only knew that if I didn't speak, I would fall apart for good. And I didn't want to fall anymore. I wanted, somehow, to learn how to stand. Evelyn entered my house with the delicacy of someone who knows she is stepping on fragile ground. She sat in front of me and waited in silence, asking no questions, just offering me her presence. For some reason, it made it easier to breathe. The cup was still cooling in my hands when I finally plucked up the courage to look at it and say that something terrible had happened. My voice cracked at first, but Evelyn didn't look away. I told him about my children's accusations, about the lawyer, about the feeling that I was losing control of my own life. She listened to everything without interrupting, just frowning in the most serious moments. When I finished the first part, she took a deep breath and asked me, tenderly and firmly, if there was anything else I would like to share. It was then that the letter burned in the memory like a burning ember. I hesitated for a few seconds, trying to decide if trusting her was wise. After all, I barely knew Evelyn beyond the garden nods and quick conversations about the weather, but something about his posture, about his calmness, made me feel protected. I got up, walked to the place where I hid the letter, and returned with the envelope in my hands. When I put the paper on the table, my hands trembled with nervousness. It was the first time he had shared that secret. Evelyn opened the letter carefully, as if she were handling something sacred. Her eyes raced across the lines, and her expression slowly changed. I saw surprise, indignation, and then a deep sadness reflected on his face. When she finished reading, she put the letter down on the table and remained silent for a few moments. I expected judgment, but what I received was understanding, an understanding that I was not used to receiving. She then told me something I didn't imagine. She was a retired lawyer, specializing precisely in guardianship cases and family disputes. My heart almost stopped in relief and disbelief. It was as if fate had put that woman on my doorstep at the exact moment I needed it most. Evelyn held my hands and said that my children had no right to intimidate me in that way. I felt a glimmer of hope born within me. We talked for over an hour, and for the first time in days, I felt like I was no longer alone. Evelyn explained each step my children would likely try to take next. He also explained what I should do to protect myself. His words were firm, but never aggressive. It was like having a compass after days lost in the middle of the storm. I clung to every instruction like someone clinging to a plank in the sea. She advised me to keep all the documents in a safe place and to record everything that had happened. He also advised me to make an appointment. I said that this would be essential if Eduardo really tried to request my interdiction. The idea that my own son could take me to court as incapable was still hard to accept. But with Evelyn by my side, it seemed less terrifying. As we talked, something changed inside me. It was as if her presence had ignited a strength that I didn't know I still had. It was not an aggressive force, but a silent, firm force, forged in pain and the need to survive. I was tired of crying and feeling helpless. I needed to somehow get back on my feet. Evelyn noticed this movement before I even fully realized it. She said I had more power than she imagined. She said that women like us, seen as fragile, carry a strength that others don't understand until it's too late. I smiled for the first time in days, albeit in a shy way. I felt the truth in her words, as if they spoke directly to my heart. I needed to believe in myself again. I had to believe that I could still fight. When Evelyn got up to leave, she hugged me with the kindness of someone who knows exactly what pain she is trying to soothe. I thanked him in silence, because the words would not come out. As I closed the door, something inside me stabilized. There was still a lot to face: pain, revelations, confrontations. But at that moment, I knew I wouldn't face anything else alone. Evelyn had become my ally, and that changed everything. If you're feeling the tension rise along with me, sign up now. The next parts of this story get even more intense. The next morning, I woke up with a different feeling. It wasn't exactly peace, but it wasn't fear either. It was as if my emotions had reorganized themselves during the night, creating a space where before there was only suffocation. I drank my coffee in silence, watching the sun's rays come through the window. For the first time, I felt that maybe there was still a way to get my life back, and I knew that Evelyn would be a key part of that. I took an old notebook and started to write down everything that had happened in the last few days. Every word said by Eduardo, every tear contained by Marina, every detail of their behavior. Evelyn said that recording everything was essential, because memory, under pressure, could be easily manipulated. As I wrote, I realized that reliving the events was painful, but also liberating. It was like putting light in the dark corners where fear hid. After writing, I began to gather documents scattered around the house. Paid bills, statements, papers with my signature, proof that I have always managed my life responsibly. With each item stored, I felt my body become firmer, as if I was recovering parts of myself. The feeling of control, even if small, gave me strength, a strength that I hadn't felt for months. In the afternoon, Evelyn returned with a folder full of notes. He sat with me at the table, with the seriousness of someone who knows that the smallest detail can mean victory or defeat. He explained the legal aspects calmly, using simple words so that I understood everything. I said that my case was not difficult to defend, but that my children could create situations to try to destabilize me. It was necessary to be prepared emotionally as well as legally. She also accompanied me to the medical appointment she had scheduled for me. The doctor, kindly, asked me simple questions that I answered clearly. In the end, he stated that I was completely capable of managing my life. The report would be a powerful weapon if Eduardo tried to act from the shadows. I left the office with a mixture of relief and anger. It was absurd that I needed to prove my sanity to my own children. Returning home, Evelyn suggested that I practice firm responses to moments of confrontation. I said that they could try to provoke me, pressure me, or even confuse me. We did some exercises, and I realized how weak my voice was, insecure. But at the same time, I realized that I could strengthen it. Evelyn said, "Speak as if you know you have a right." And I repeated, even shaking. It was strange, but also necessary. In the following days, we continued to organize everything. I took John's letter to a protected envelope, and Evelyn insisted that we take certified copies. She explained that this letter could become the center of a confrontation and that we needed to ensure its integrity. Each step felt like a shield being built around me, a piece of protection from the storm my children were preparing. Even so, there were times when sadness overwhelmed me. When looking at old photos, I remembered when Eduardo hugged me without thinking about material goods. He remembered Marina playing in the garden, laughing lightly that no longer exists. It was hard to accept that those same children now saw me as an obstacle. At those times, Evelyn would put her hand on my shoulder and say that loving is not the same as letting yourself be destroyed. This phrase accompanied me for days. Gradually, I realized something even deeper. I was changing. The passive, silent woman, who struggled not to bother, was lagging behind. In his place came someone who learned to face, to question, to resist. Someone who, despite being tired, still managed to raise her head. And this transformation didn't just come from the letter or the threats, it came from the need to survive the truth. Later that week, I sat on the porch and realized that the fear had changed color. Before, it was a monster that swallowed me. Now it was a warning, an impulse to stay alert and aware. The battle was just beginning, but I was no longer the victim my children imagined. With Evelyn by my side, I had a plan. And, for the first time, he also had the will to fight to the end. The tension between Eduardo and Marina intensified in the days that followed, as if the house had become a minefield where any word could explode a conflict. I watched from afar, trying to understand when everything had turned into this constant battle. Eduardo always arrived with a hard look, looking for mistakes that I didn't make. Marina, on the other hand, seemed more nervous than usual, stumbling over meaningless justifications. The atmosphere was so heavy that even the air seemed hard to breathe. Whenever I tried to talk to them together, I ended up caught between cross accusations. Eduardo said that Marina manipulated my emotions, that I was always soft with her. Marina replied that Eduardo only thought about money, that he didn't even really care about me. It was like watching a cruel duel between brothers who no longer recognized each other. And, even without knowing the letter, both seemed to feel an invisible weight that distanced them even more. I wanted to intervene, but any attempt was seen as bias. Eduardo began to appear with spreadsheets, printed documents, and a coldness that chilled me inside. He talked about assets that I didn't know I had, expenses that I supposedly couldn't manage. I realized that he was building a case against me, piece by piece, like an investigator who had already decided on the verdict. My own home became a silent courtroom where I was always the defendant. The injustice of this hurt me in places I didn't even know existed. Marina also changed, even if in a more discreet way. She would sit on the couch for long minutes, fidgeting with her fingers, without looking at me directly. It was as if guilt was always lurking inside her. I didn't know yet if it was the fault of something he did or just something I felt, but the restlessness was evident. Sometimes, I would find her crying alone in the hallway, claiming to be nothing. But nothing in those days was really nothing. Everything was loaded. I tried to eat meals in silence, hoping that the simple act of sharing the table could bring them closer again. But the conversations became discussions before they even began. Eduardo said that I needed to accept help. Marina defended that I was being pressured. I felt like a fuse placed between two sparks. The fear that my family would crumble before my eyes kept me up at night every night. The cruelest thing was to realize that they were not fighting for me, but for what they could gain, or lose, if I resisted. The word heritage began to echo in their speeches like a ghost that crossed every conversation. I didn't see myself as a rich woman, just someone who had a home, some savings, and a lifetime of memories. But for them, apparently, it was enough to justify a war. At times, I tried to remember them when they were children, running around the garden, fighting only over toys or pieces of cake. How did that turn into this? It was as if love had been eroded little by resentments that I never realized. Or maybe you never wanted to notice. Guilt invaded me silently, asking what I failed to do, what I did wrong, what I could have avoided. One night, I heard Eduardo and Marina arguing outside the house. His voice was aggressive, and hers was desperate. I stood behind the door, not daring to open it, listening to each accusation as if they were blows to my own body. They mentioned something about proofs and giving no advantage to anyone. The absence of the word mother in that conversation was what hurt the most. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them. When the argument was over, I went back inside and sat on the edge of the bed. The weight of loneliness enveloped me like a cold blanket. I thought of Evelyn, how she said that family conflicts are often the shell of something much deeper. I thought of the letter, of the secret that hung over us like a silent ghost. Everything was about to explode, and I knew it. I felt it in every beat of my heart. I took a deep breath and decided that, as painful as it was, I needed to be prepared for the worst. My children weren't just fighting each other. They were opening wounds they didn't know they had. And when the truth emerged, those wounds could become chasms. I just didn't know that the moment of rupture was much closer than I imagined. On the morning that everything changed, the house was quieter than usual. I went into the room to get a box where I kept some important documents, but I found Marina sitting on the floor, holding John's letter in her hands. My heart stopped. That envelope I had hidden so carefully now lay open before her hands shaking as if holding a glowing piece of truth. I felt the blood disappear from my face. Marina looked up at me, and in them there was a mixture of astonishment, pain, and something I had never seen before, disintegration. As if her entire identity had been dismantled in a single instant. She tried to speak, but her voice came out broken, barely audible. I stood still, unable to move or think of a sentence capable of lessening that pain. I knew this moment would come, but I didn't imagine it would be so devastating. When she finally managed to utter a few words, they came tearing through the air like daggers. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" There was no tone of accusation, but of abandonment. I felt like the worst mother in the world. I tried to explain that I myself had only recently found out that John kept the secret until the end. But Marina shook her head, denying everything, as if any explanation was insufficient. Her pain was so deep that it almost hurt me physically. She started crying in a way I had never seen. It was not the cry of sadness. Marina held the letter to her chest as if she were trying to pull something out of herself. I took a few steps towards her, but she backed away as if my presence was unbearable. The rejection cut me like a blade, and I felt my chest burn. In the midst of the chaos, Eduardo appeared at the door. His eyes went straight to the letter and then to me, with an expression of pure shock. In 2 seconds, he understood everything. But, unlike Marina, her reaction was explosive. He accused me of having hidden the truth for years, of intentional destruction of the family, of manipulation. His words came fast, sharp, as if he was exorcising something that had always been trapped inside him. And I, helpless, could only hear. I tried to say that I never knew, that I myself was dealing with that recent revelation, but Eduardo didn't want to listen. He approached me with a look I had never seen before, not simple anger, but hatred. "You made us live a lie," he shouted. The accusation pierced my chest like an arrow. My own son, calling my whole life a lie. The pain of this made me falter. Marina, in turn, continued to cry, repeating that she was not part of the family, that she never belonged, that everything made sense now, the distance, the veiled preference, the cold in Eduardo's eyes during childhood. The letter had become a cruel mirror that showed all the cracks that I had never noticed. I wanted to hug her, to say that none of this changed the love I had for her. But Marina wasn't ready to hear that. She could barely breathe. Eduardo began to walk around the house like a caged animal, knocking over objects, opening doors, looking for explanations that did not exist. He shouted about betrayal, about shame, about how I always knew there was something wrong. It was as if the letter had unleashed all the monsters he had tried to hide his entire life. And I, without strength, could only watch the collapse of my world. It was as if the whole family was crumbling at the same time. At one point, Eduardo pointed to me and said that now there was reason to interdict me. He said I was dangerous, unstable, a liar. Evelyn had prepared me for manipulations, but nothing could have prepared me to hear this from my own son. I felt as if the air had been ripped out of my lungs. I didn't know whether to cry for him, for Marina, for John, or for me, maybe by all of us. When they finally left the house, each in one direction, each destroyed in their own way, I was overcome with a deafening silence. The letter was on the floor, open, stained by Marina's tears. I knelt next to her and closed my eyes, feeling that something inside me was dying along with that moment. But at the same time, something new was born. Something hard, necessary, inevitable. I knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same as before. and that I would need to be stronger than I have ever been. After the door closed behind them, the silence that took over the house was unlike any others I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of life. I stood in the middle of the room, staring into the void, trying to understand how, in such a short time, everything had fallen apart in such a way. The air seemed too heavy to breathe. The feeling of failure enveloped me like a damp and cold blanket. The letter was still on the floor, open like an open wound. I knelt down with difficulty and picked it up carefully, as if it could break once and for all. Marina's tears stared at me, mixed with John's words. I didn't know if I felt more pain for him, for her, or for myself. It was as if we had all been victims of a secret that no one asked to carry. And yet, we were all paying the price. I got up slowly and put the letter away again, this time in an even more protected place. Not out of fear that someone would find her, but because she understood the power she had. That piece of paper could destroy relationships, but it could also be the only chance for truth we had left. I closed the hiding place with trembling hands, feeling that I kept a very large part of me there, a part that might never be the same again. The next few hours dragged on, and I found myself wandering around the house like a ghost. I touched the walls, the furniture, the photos, as if I was saying goodbye to everything. Eduardo's words echoed inside me, "You made us live a lie." I knew it wasn't that simple, but my feelings didn't obey logic. Guilt, even when unfair, knows how to be convincing, and it settled on me with devastating force. As the sun began to set, I realized that I hadn't eaten anything all day. I went to the kitchen more out of habit than hunger. I made a tea, but the bitter taste seemed to match everything I felt. I sat at the table, holding the cup with both hands, trying to find some solace in the warmth of the liquid. But what I wanted most at that moment was the warmth of a hug that would not come. Neither Eduardo's, nor Marina's. I looked out the window and saw the garden that was once full of laughter. I remembered Marina running among the flowers, Eduardo trying to look like an adult while carrying heavy vases. Everything seemed so far away, almost as if it belonged to another life. That house, which was once a symbol of love and construction, now seemed to be the scene of ruin. And, at the center of it all, me. An old woman, tired, trying to pick up the pieces of an entire family alone. When night fell for good, I felt the weight of loneliness intensify. I thought about picking up the phone and calling one of the two, begging them to come back, explaining once again what I was also still trying to understand. But something inside me stopped me. Maybe the wounded pride, maybe the need to respect myself for the first time in a long time. I knew I couldn't keep kneeling emotionally in front of those who kicked me without looking back. The tears returned, but this time they were different. They were not only tears of pain, they were also tears of farewell. Farewell to the mother who always tried to keep the peace at any cost. Farewell to the woman who accepted everything so as not to be abandoned. If I was already alone, at least this loneliness was good for something. That it was the starting point of a new version of myself, however late it might be. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up startled by a confused dream in which the house was collapsing as I tried to save everyone. I sat up on the bed, panting, my heart racing. It was at that moment that I understood clearly. I could no longer control everything. I could not save everyone. The only person who was still within my reach was myself. And, as much as it hurt, I needed to start choosing myself. I got up, went to the living room and looked around. It still hurt, it was still hard, but something inside me had changed. My children were gone, carrying with them their pain and their accusations. I was, in fact, abandoned by them at that moment. But for the first time, I didn't feel completely empty. There was a small flame lit inside me, a will, still shy, to survive all that. For me. The next morning, the sun came through the window with an insistence that bothered me at first. I wanted to stay in the dark, quiet, hidden from the consequences of everything. But the light seemed to say that the world would not stop because of my pain. I stood up slowly, each muscle heavy, and walked to the mirror. The tired face was still there, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a new, small but real firmness. It was not the end. It was the beginning of something else. I prepared the coffee as usual, but this time each movement had a different purpose. I wasn't just following a routine, I was claiming a piece of my normalcy. The house was still full of memories from the day before, but I started to collect some fallen objects, to put things out of place. It was not a simple tidying up, it was a symbolic gesture. I was reorganizing not only the space, but also what was left of me. A short time later, I heard a knock on the door. My heart raced, thinking it could be Eduardo or Marina. When I opened it, I found Evelyn, with the same attentive and firm look. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me for a few seconds, as if assessing the damage. Then, without asking anything, he pulled me into a hug. I broke down again, but this time the crying was not of total despair. It was also a relief that there was still someone there. We sat at the table and I told him everything that had happened. Marina's discovery, Eduardo's reaction, the harsh words, the departure of the two. Evelyn listened to me attentively, and when I finished, her eyes reflected indignation. She said that my pains were legitimate, but that I couldn't let the guilt swallow me. "You are also a victim of all this," she said. It was strange to hear that, because I always put myself only as guilty or responsible. She then began to speak with that professional clarity that impressed me. It reminded me that, legally, I was still in full possession of my rights. And emotionally, I needed to start acting like someone who wasn't on the verge of collapse, but at the beginning of a rebuild. We discussed the next steps, reinforcing documents, keeping in touch with the doctor, keeping the letter safe. All of this gave me a sense of structure, something I hadn't felt in days. Evelyn suggested that I write a letter to each of my children, not to send at that moment, but to organize what I wanted to say to them. She explained that anger and pain often get in the way of words, and that writing could prevent me from regretting it later. I took a pen and paper, and just the act of starting was difficult. But, little by little, I put on paper what my heart was screaming: love, sorrow, truth. As I wrote, I realized how much I kept quiet for years. How many times have I stopped speaking for fear of creating conflicts, for fear of losing? And now, in the end, he had lost the same way. The difference was that, this time, I didn't want to betray myself anymore. If they didn't want to listen, that's fine, but I would no longer be complicit in my own silence. This realization brought a strange but powerful force. Evelyn also encouraged me to take up small things that I liked to do and that I had abandoned. I suggested that I go back to cooking for others, as I did at church parties, or helping out at the community center. At first, I thought the idea was absurd. How could I think of helping someone, if I could barely help myself? But she insisted that occupying her heart with something other than pain could be a form of healing. And, deep down, I knew she was right. That afternoon, I called the neighborhood community center. My voice was still weak, but I was able to offer to help with the meals of the elderly. On the other end of the line, a warm voice thanked me and said that I would be very welcome. As I hung up, I felt a spark of purpose reignite within me. Maybe I could still be useful to someone. Perhaps there was still room for something good, even in the midst of the disorder. In the evening, I sat down in the living room again, but this time with a different feeling. There was still pain, fear, longing, but there was also a thread of determination running through it all. I knew my children needed to face their own truths, just as I was facing mine. He could no longer carry them in his arms, nor protect them from the consequences. But I could protect myself, and for the first time, I was willing to do that. Before going to sleep, I walked over to John's portrait on the wall. I looked at him, and instead of just sadness, I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and anger. I touched the frame and whispered that I would do what he had asked in the letter. I would not let the truth destroy what was left of us. But I also promised myself that, this time, I would be at the center of my own story. No longer as a silent victim, but as a woman who, even wounded, decides to stand up. The day of the hearing came faster than I would have liked, and I woke up even before the sun rose. I spent a few minutes sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to control my breathing. The house was silent, but that silence didn't hurt me in the same way it had before. It was a silence of concentration, of preparation. I put on a simple but firm outfit, as if I could sew courage into the fabric. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see the defeated woman of the previous days. I saw someone who was ready to fight. Evelyn arrived early, with an organized folder and her usual sure look. She didn't say much, just smiled and touched my arm, as if reminding me that I wouldn't face it alone. In the car, the drive to the courthouse seemed endless. My hands were sweating, and my mind was reviewing every detail of the letter, every injury, every moment I almost gave up. But Evelyn, sitting next to me, was a constant reminder that I had a right to be there, as a woman, as a mother, as a person. As we entered the courtroom, I felt the weight of the gazes falling on me. Eduardo was sitting on one side, rigid, accompanied by his lawyer. Marina was further back, with red eyes, avoiding staring at me. That scene broke me inside, but I stood firm. I knew I wasn't there to convince them of my love, but to defend my dignity. The judge entered the room with an austere posture, and the atmosphere became even more tense. Eduardo's lawyer began by speaking, describing me as someone unstable, emotionally fragile, and unable to manage his own life. I listened to every word without interruption, but inside my soul screamed. He used isolated episodes of my grief, moments of weakness, and even old confusions with dates to assemble a portrait of someone who did not exist. I wondered how many times women like me had been silenced like this, reduced to caricatures of fragility. When it was our turn, Evelyn stood up with the firm posture of someone who dominates the terrain. She spoke with elegance and force, dismantling point by point of their argument. He showed the documents we organized, the medical report that proved my lucidity and even records of volunteer activities. Then he asked that I be heard directly. The judge nodded, and my heart raced. It was my voice, finally, that would fill that room. Standing up, I felt my legs tremble, but my voice came out firmer than I expected. I talked about my life, about my autonomy, about the care I always had with everything I built. And then, with Evelyn's permission, I handed the judge the sealed envelope with John's letter. It was like giving away a piece of my heart. I explained, cautiously, that this truth had been used to justify family distances and tensions, and now it was being used, albeit indirectly, to try to silence me. The judge read part of the letter discreetly, but it was enough to understand the seriousness of the situation. His gaze changed throughout the reading, as if he realized that the root of the conflict was much deeper than a simple dispute over goods. Eduardo, on the other side of the room, turned pale, and Marina began to cry softly. The truth, finally exposed, hung over us like an icy wind. It was not a victory, it was a cut, necessary but painful. When the judge spoke again, her voice was firm. She stated that there was no justification for my interdiction and that I was fully able to manage my own life. He reprimanded Edward for the hasty attempt and the use of inconsistent arguments. The sense of justice began to warm my chest, but it was accompanied by a deep bitterness. Being right didn't mean getting my family back. At the end, Marina got up and left the room crying, and Eduardo remained seated, motionless, as if trying to understand how everything got out of his control. Evelyn put her hand on my shoulder, and I finally took a real breath. The fight was not over yet, but I had won that battle. And I had won as myself, not as the frail woman they tried to make me. As I left the courtroom, I felt the sun hit my face with a different intensity. It was as if the world was telling me that I had survived yet another storm. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. When he arrived home, the feeling of victory mixed with a deep sadness. The hearing was over, but the emotional damage was still present inside me. I walked around the room, touching the furniture as if to confirm that everything was still there. The house felt like both a home and an abandoned battlefield. Evelyn insisted that I rest, but peace did not come easily. The weight of revealed truth still fell on my shoulders. I sat down in the armchair and closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The sound of the judge's voice echoed in my mind, declaring my full capacity. It was a powerful validation, but it was incomplete. Legal victory does not rebuild relationships. And somehow, the fact that I had to defend my sanity in front of my own children hurt more than any accusation. It was like an invisible cut that only I could feel, and it would take time to heal. In the late afternoon, I heard footsteps in the garden, and when I looked out the window, I saw Marina standing near the flowers I planted myself so many years ago. She seemed small, fragile, hugging her own body. I left slowly and stopped next to him, without saying anything. For a few seconds, we just listened to the wind stir the leaves. Then she spoke, her voice broken. He said he didn't know who he was, that the truth had shattered everything he believed about himself. My heart sank as I listened to her, but I also felt a deep compassion. I touched her arm carefully, and she didn't back down this time. Marina said that she never wanted to hurt me and that, although she was hurt, she understood that I was too. She apologized between sobs, and I hugged her as tightly as I could. It wasn't total forgiveness, there was still much to heal, but it was a start. A small point of light in the midst of chaos. However, Eduardo did not appear. Not in the garden, not on the phone, not in any attempt to contact them. Evelyn told me not to expect this so soon. Some children break down before they rebuild, and Eduardo seemed to have chosen anger as an emotional crutch. I loved him, but I couldn't save him. This truth hurt like fire, but it also set me free. Raising children does not mean carrying their mistakes forever. That night, I received a phone call from Eduardo's lawyer. He said, dryly, that Eduardo would withdraw any action against me, but he did not intend to keep in touch at the moment. The lawyer's voice was too cold for me to try to answer something emotional. I formally thanked him, hung up the phone, and allowed the tears to fall. It was official. My son had chosen to push me away, and I would need to learn to live with it. To try to regain my balance, I cleaned the entire house the next day. Each room, each corner, each piece of furniture seemed to carry a part of the recent pain. As I cleaned up, I thought about how much I had transformed in the last few weeks. Before, I would have waited for someone to come and help me. Now, I cleaned not out of obligation, but as a symbol of renewal. It was my way of reconnecting with the space I almost lost. I also received a call from the community center confirming my registration as a volunteer. The news warmed my heart in an unexpected way. Being useful again, helping other people, occupying my time with something other than pain, all of this sounded like a promise of the future. I was old, yes, tired, yes, but still alive, still capable, still needed somewhere. In the evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sky slowly darken. Evelyn passed by and sat next to me, in silence. We didn't need to say anything. She knew I was starting to rebuild my life, piece by piece. And I knew that this process would be slow, imperfect, and sometimes painful. But it was no longer impossible. As I watched the stars come up, I realized something I hadn't understood before. The truth hadn't destroyed everything. She had revealed what was already broken and showed me that, even though I was fragile, I could still choose how to live what was left of my days. For the first time, I felt that perhaps I was able to find peace, not the old peace, but a new, firmer, more conscious, more my own. The days that followed were strangely silent, but not that oppressive silence that crushed me at first. It was a lighter silence, as if the house was trying to relearn how to breathe with me. I started to reorganize drawers, donate old clothes, move furniture around. It wasn't just tidying up, it was a farewell ritual for the version of me that accepted to live in the shadow of others. Each change in the environment seemed to say, now, you exist for yourself. In the first week as a volunteer, I felt butterflies in my stomach that I hadn't felt in years. Carrying trays, serving meals, listening to other people's stories. All this made me realize that my life was not as small as I imagined. There was still so much world beyond pain. A white-haired lady held my hand and said that I had eyes of someone who has cried a lot, but still sees beauty. That phrase stayed with me all day, like a discreet hug. At home, I continued to tend the garden, something I had let die little by little. I planted new flowers, cleaned the hardened soil, and repaired the broken pots. As I worked, I realized that the garden was a perfect metaphor for my life. I couldn't uproot the past, but I could grow something new alongside it. And little by little, the first shoots began to appear, shy but full of life. Marina started to visit me occasionally, always with hesitant steps, as if they are still afraid of breaking the ground they walk on. We talked little, but enough. She was in therapy, trying to understand who she was in light of revealed truth. Sometimes she cried and I hugged her. Other times, we were just silent, watching the garden bloom. Our relationship was not the same as before. It may never return, but there was enough affection to start again. Eduardo, on the other hand, remained distant. I received a short, formal message, saying that I was fine and needed time, nothing more. I read those words with a heavy heart, but with a new acceptance within me. Evelyn said that some people hide behind anger when they can't deal with their own shame, and maybe Eduardo was fighting more demons than I imagined. I kept leaving a light on for him, metaphorical and literal, but without losing my own light in the process. One afternoon, while tidying up the attic, I found another box that I didn't remember keeping. Inside were John's old objects, a broken watch, stored letters, photographs that I had forgotten myself. At the bottom of the box, a small sealed envelope without a recipient. For a moment, my heart froze. Was it another revelation? Another truth that I would have to carry alone? I took a deep breath and decided, this time, to wait. Not every truth needs to be discovered immediately. Some require the right time, and I had finally learned to honor that. I began to dedicate my mornings to the community center and my afternoons to the garden. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sky change color. The pain still existed, of course, but it no longer controlled my steps. It was a scar that I learned to touch without bleeding. Evelyn was still by my side, firm as ever, reminding me that new beginnings are not measured in perfect victories, but in small acts of courage. I also realized that my house, previously a scene of fear and tension, was becoming a home again. A different home, quieter, more mine. I started to put up new curtains, change paintings, leave windows open for the wind to enter. It was as if the house was finally breathing with me, learning to exist without screaming, without disputes, without judgments. I no longer had a perfect family, maybe I never did, but I did have a place where I could flourish. At times, loneliness still found me. She sat next to me on the porch, like an old friend, but now she didn't scare me. I understood that being alone was not the same as being lost. It was only part of the way. And on many days, I preferred this quiet solitude to the presence of voices that diminished me. The strength I found within me was silent but profound, and I respected it as something sacred. In the end, I realized that my story wasn't about losing my children or about the secret of the past. It was about finding myself again after a lifetime of trying to be the pillar of others. It was about learning that love doesn't have to be carried like a cross, and that dignity, once regained, can no longer be taken away. As I looked up at the sky that night, I felt a rare peace fill my chest. It wasn't the perfect ending, but it was my new beginning, and for the first time, that was enough. Now I want to know from you, what would you do in my place? Do you believe that Helena should forgive her children? Or do you think that, after all, she is right to move on with life keeping her distance? Comment below your opinion. It is very important to me and to the growth of the channel. I want to read each one of you.